He'd kicked her out when she was on the verge, no explanation, no chance. 6 years later, she flew in for his wedding with twins he'd never seen, and with a truth no one expected. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. The late afternoon sun bathed the sprawling estate of the Lawrence family in golden light, glinting off crystal goblets and glimmering chandeliers strung among ancient oak trees. Rows of white chairs lined the manicured garden, facing a floral altar so meticulously adorned it could have graced the cover of any bridal magazine. White rose petals lay scattered across the trimmed grass like delicate confetti, trembling gently in the breeze. The music of a string quartet floated through the air, light and elegant, blending with the soft murmurs of nearly 300 guests, politicians, CEOs, dignitaries, and socialites, who sipped champagne and adjusted their designer ensembles. Graham Lawrence stood near the altar, the picture of composure in a hand-tailored tuxedo that hugged his lean frame. His sandy blonde hair was combed back with precise elegance, his jaw set with practiced ease. He was the kind of man people trusted on sight. Poised, successful, bred for command. At 35, he was not only the CEO of Lawrence Biomedical, but also the future son-in-law of a powerful senator. Today was the crowning jewel in a life meticulously curated by generations of wealth, power, and control. Today, Graham would marry Caroline Ashton, and the world would witness the union of two dynasties. The guests began taking their seats as the musicians shifted seamlessly into the soft strains of Pachelbel's canon. A hush settled, anticipation prickling in the air. The bridesmaids glided down the aisle, followed by a ring-bearer in a velvet suit, carrying a cushion as solemnly as a judge. At the end of the pathway, Caroline waited, radiant in a gown of ivory silk and antique lace, her arm looped through her father's. She was stunning, as expected, her every detail polished, her smile precise. Graham's mother, Louise Lawrence, sat in the front row, her back impossibly straight, her pearl necklace gleaming against the deep navy of her couture suit. Her face bore a mask of serene pride, though her eyes flicked constantly between the altar and the aisle, as if assessing for flaws. This moment had been planned for nearly a year. Every flower, every menu item, every gesture had been selected not only for elegance, but for what it would communicate: refinement, tradition, supremacy. And yet, Graham, as he looked out over the crowd and then down at his polished shoes, felt a strange hollowness settle in his chest. It was faint, like a whisper in a storm, but persistent. The music, the applause, the smiling faces, everything felt suspended, almost theatrical. There was a dissonance in him, a tremor he could not name. He clenched his jaw and shifted his stance, forcing a smile as Caroline began her slow, graceful walk toward him. Then came the sound. At first, it was so distant that many dismissed it as nothing more than the passing hum of a highway or perhaps a misfired speaker. But it grew louder, unmistakably mechanical, a heavy rhythmic chopping that disrupted the rhythm of the quartet. Heads turned. The officiant faltered mid-sentence. Louise Lawrence's eyes narrowed. Above the estate, a dark speck approached from the horizon, growing larger with every pulse of its rotor blades. The quartet stopped playing. Conversations died. Every guest turned toward the sky as the black helicopter descended from the clouds, its presence dominating the sky above the ceremony. The security detail, until now mere fixtures at the perimeter of the estate, sprang into motion, speaking rapidly into their earpieces, exchanging tight-lipped glances. No one authorized a flyover, one of them muttered into a mic. The helicopter hovered a moment before lowering onto the estate's private landing pad just beyond the outer edge of the garden. Petals swirled from the ground in the artificial wind. Caroline froze mid-step, her veil lifting slightly from her shoulders. Graham's smile vanished. His heart slammed once against his ribcage and then seemed to forget how to beat. The rotors slowed. The side door swung open, and out she stepped. Tall, poised, unmistakably graceful, the woman descended the steps of the helicopter like a queen. Her skin was a deep, radiant brown that shimmered against the twilight sun. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek chignon, and she wore a navy blue pantsuit that molded to her figure with understated elegance. Her heels clicked softly against the stone walkway as she moved forward, steady and unhurried. Flanking her on either side were two little girls, perhaps 6 years old, each holding one of her hands. They were dressed in identical white dresses with pale blue sashes, their curls neatly styled, their shoes pristine. Though they clung lightly to the woman, their postures were confident, their expressions curious, alert. They looked neither frightened nor confused. They looked like they belonged. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Cameras lifted. Caroline turned her head sharply toward Graham. "What is this?" she hissed, voice trembling not from fear, but fury. Graham didn't answer. His throat had closed up entirely. His gaze was locked on the woman, on the children. His world had narrowed to the space they occupied, and nothing else existed. He knew those faces. He knew her face. Every line, every shadow, every movement awakened 100 memories he had spent 6 years trying to bury. Amara. She was supposed to be gone. She had vanished from his life like a shadow retreating before sunrise. He had been told she left the country, that she never wanted contact, that the matter had been resolved. But she was here, and the children, his children. Louise Lawrence rose to her feet, one gloved hand clasping her pearls as if to physically restrain the gasp forming in her throat. Her husband, Everett, stood beside her, a subtle tremor in his hand. "My God," he whispered. "Look at them." Amara continued down the garden path, never breaking stride. She didn't look at the guests, didn't acknowledge the whispers or the stunned silence. She walked with purpose, her gaze locked on Graham, the children steady at her sides. There was power in the quiet dignity of her presence, a sovereignty that no wealth could purchase and no scandal could destroy. Caroline turned to Graham again, more insistent now. "Who is that? What is she doing here?" Still, he didn't answer, because suddenly everything he had tried not to remember came roaring back. The sound of her laughter in their small Brooklyn apartment, the way her fingers trailed across his collarbone as she fell asleep, the fire in her voice when she spoke of inequity and justice. The betrayal he believed she committed, the accusations, the confrontation, the silence that followed. Amara stopped 5 paces from the altar. The children stood beside her, holding her hands. Her eyes met Graham's with the calm, unreadable expression of someone who had already lived through a lifetime of storms. The garden, once so perfectly choreographed, now trembled in the weight of unscripted truth. She didn't need to speak for the message to be clear. We exist. You cannot erase us. The officiant looked helplessly at the bride and groom, unsure whether to continue. Caroline's face was frozen, pale beneath her makeup. Louise had sunk back into her seat, but her eyes blazed with a fury that trembled on the edge of panic. Finally, Amara broke the silence. She turned slightly to the side and looked down at her daughters. "Go on," she said gently, and the girls stepped forward, not toward the altar, but toward the stunned guests. One of them, taller, more serious, held up a photograph in her hand, which she offered to a woman in the front row. It was a picture of Graham, holding a baby. Caroline made a sound between a sob and a scream, and for the first time in his life, Graham Lawrence had no idea which life was truly his, the one carefully curated for the world's consumption, or the one standing before him now, uninvited, unbending, and irrevocably his. Long before the wedding, before the roses and the silk and the watching world, there had been a dusty courtyard under a Kenyan sky, and two people who had believed they could exist outside the constraints of lineage, color, and legacy. Graham had arrived in Nairobi on assignment for the Lawrence Foundation's International Medical Outreach, a project meant to bolster the public image of the company and give its younger executives a taste of global responsibility. He had gone with the swagger of a man who had always been told the world was his to fix, his to reshape in his own image. He hadn't expected her. Amara was not what he had been told to expect in a field doctor. She didn't bow to authority or try to impress him with borrowed charm. She wore old jeans and dusty boots, spoke 5 languages fluently, and managed a clinic that saved lives daily on a budget smaller than Graham's weekend retreat expenses. She had sharp eyes and a sharp tongue, and when she first met him, she had greeted him with a curt nod and returned to suturing a gunshot wound on a boy no older than 10. But Graham, who had never lacked for admiration, found himself lingering around her clinic longer than necessary. He asked questions, listened to her patients, shadowed her rounds under the heat of the sun. Slowly, his easy smiles became more sincere, his gaze more focused. He brought her coffee in the mornings, argued with her over treatment protocols, stayed late to repair solar panels and carry supplies. One night, during a thunderstorm, they had taken shelter beneath a tin awning, and he had kissed her, an impulsive, breathless thing born from weeks of proximity and the slow erosion of caution. What began as an unlikely partnership became something neither of them expected. In the months that followed, they were inseparable, building routines from chaos, inventing joy where none was promised. When his foundation funding ended, Graham extended his stay. When Amara fell ill with a virus that swept the region, he slept on the floor beside her cot, cooling her forehead with wet cloths. She teased him about his soft hands, his useless designer luggage, but her voice softened when she spoke his name. It was the kind of love that bloomed in dust, unplanned and defiant. They were married in a village ceremony, barefoot and laughing, with woven bands of cloth tied around their fingers in place of rings. There was no press, no contracts, no guest list, just local music, a borrowed white dress, and the fierce conviction that love could withstand the weight of the world. When they returned to New York, reality struck with a whisper, then a blow. Graham didn't tell his parents. He told himself he was protecting her, that he needed time to explain, to prepare them, that the world they came from wasn't ready to see him married to a black woman, let alone one from a background they would call unvetted. His father had spent decades building Lawrence Biomedical into a legacy company, and his mother, Louise, ruled over their social circle with the precision of a queen managing a fragile court. Amara's name did not belong in that world. Still, they made a life together. A modest brownstone in Brooklyn, her work at a local hospital, his role in the company. They cooked together, danced in the kitchen, argued over politics, made up with laughter. She taught him how to question the systems he once defended. He tried, in his way, to meet her there. And for a time it was enough, but shadows crept in, whispers at company events, raised eyebrows from colleagues. When Amara came to a fundraiser and was mistaken for staff, Graham laughed it off. When his mother accidentally sent an invitation addressed only to him, he deleted the email. And when, during a board retreat, someone asked him quietly if the rumors of his African wife were true, his silence lingered too long. He still hadn't told them. Then the photos came. Printed screenshots, email threads, hotel receipts, text messages between Amara and a man named Daniel. The messages were explicit, the tone intimate. Some even included references to their home, details only someone close could know. Graham had returned early from a trip to find the envelope on his desk and a letter from an anonymous sender advising him to reconsider the woman in his bed. He confronted her that night. Amara, fresh from a shower, had found him seated on the edge of their bed, holding the pages with trembling hands. He didn't shout. He simply asked who Daniel was, his voice razor-sharp with restrained fury. She frowned, confused. When he showed her the messages, her confusion turned to horror. "I don't know this man," she had said. "I never wrote these. Graham, I swear." But he didn't believe her. His mind, fed for years by warnings and subtle poison, had been waiting for this proof. He accused her of betrayal, of infidelity, of making him a fool. She protested, reaching for him, begging him to see the inconsistencies, to listen to reason. But he had stopped listening. He told her to leave, to take whatever pride she had left and get out. She left with a backpack and her dignity. He never followed. What Graham never knew, what he had never allowed her to say, was that she was already pregnant. In the weeks that followed, Amara moved through New York like a ghost. She found a room in a shelter, filed what papers she could, and tried to make sense of what had happened. Her calls to his office went unanswered. The company issued a formal letter through lawyers confirming the annulment of all spousal privileges. Her hospital quietly terminated her contract after receiving a tip about moral misconduct. Her visa, once tied to a research fellowship, was allowed to lapse. She was alone, jobless, pregnant. But she did not break. Amara found work in under-the-table clinics in Queens, cleaning wounds and filing charts. She borrowed textbooks from public libraries, studied at night in a corner of a shared room. Her body changed. She learned the shape of survival, memorized the schedules of food banks, built a routine out of necessity. When the time came, she gave birth to twin girls at a low-cost women's health center, biting down on a towel during contractions because no one had time for anesthesia. She named them Maya and Nia. She did not put Graham's name on the birth certificates. The first year was a blur of bottle feedings and exhaustion, of navigating public transportation with 2 infants strapped to her chest, of learning which corners were safest at night. She met other mothers, shared resources, traded shifts, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to rebuild. By the time the girls turned 3, Amara had passed her U.S. medical exams. She used a pseudonym to apply for a role at a community clinic in Harlem and began treating patients again. Her bedside manner was unmatched. Her diagnostic accuracy became legendary. And when a journalist featured her in a story about Black women physicians working in underserved neighborhoods, donations began to flow. A grant from an international aid organization followed. Then another. Amara started her own clinic. It was small, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered church, but it was hers. She staffed it with people the system had forgotten. Immigrants, former inmates, single mothers. The community came. They lined up around the block. She treated asthma, diabetes, gunshot wounds. She taught nutrition classes, ran mental health seminars, kept the lights on with sheer willpower and a dozen side hustles. She did not tell her daughters about their father, not in detail. When they asked, she said he had been someone who helped her once, someone who had to leave. She showed them his eyes in their own reflections, taught them to stand tall and speak clearly. She taught them to ask questions, to tell the truth, to keep their heads high when the world wanted them bowed. And she waited, not for Graham, for the right moment. That moment came when she saw a feature in a lifestyle magazine. Inside the wedding of the season, Graham Lawrence and Caroline Ashton. The date sent a chill through her. It was set for June 12th, the same day she had been told to leave, the same day she had stood in the rain, alone and newly pregnant, outside the gates of a life she had once called home. She stared at the photo on the page. Graham, smiling beside a blonde woman in a fitted white dress. His eyes were just as she remembered, though colder, more distant. The article mentioned nothing of his past, no hint of Amara, no acknowledgement of their marriage, their daughters, their history. She realized then what this wedding truly was, not a celebration, but an erasure. So she made a choice. She gathered documents, the original marriage certificate, the timeline of events, copies of her hospital contract, the digital forensics report that proved the messages had been fabricated. She hired a private investigator who traced the origin of the messages to a shell company with ties to Louise Lawrence's legal team. She ordered a DNA test taken from a coffee cup Graham had used at a public panel 2 months prior. The results were undeniable. She did not seek revenge, she sought truth. And when a grateful patient, an airline executive whose mother Amara had saved from diabetic shock, offered her a favor, she didn't hesitate. The helicopter was arranged, the landing approved. Her daughters picked out their dresses, rehearsed what they would say. She told them only what they needed to know. They were going to meet someone important. Someone who had once loved her very much, but had forgotten how. Amara stood in the mirror the morning of the wedding, adjusting the collar of her navy suit. Her reflection stared back at her, older, wiser, unbent. Behind her, her daughters waited, small hands clasped, eyes bright with questions. "You ready, Mama?" Maya asked. She turned, smiled. "I've been ready for 6 years." The helicopter blades began to turn, and they rose. Even after the helicopter landed and the pedals had settled and the whispers died down into taut silence, Amara stood like a monument amid the confusion, unmoving, eyes locked on Graham's. The girls, Maya and Nia, stood flanking her, their small bodies as still as their mothers', their presence not uncertain but declarative. The scene had become a tableau that no camera dared frame and no polite excuse could dissolve. It wasn't until Caroline let out a stifled cry and turned sharply away from the altar, her carefully applied mask of control cracking, that Graham took his first step. He didn't know where he was walking, toward his past or toward a reckoning, but he moved forward, the silence of hundreds wrapping tightly around his every motion. He reached the edge of the aisle and stopped. He stood mere feet from the woman he had once sworn to love until death. And she looked, if anything, more alive than he remembered. Their eyes met, and in the frozen moment between memory and presence, everything inside him tilted. But Amara did not flinch. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned to the girls. "Go ahead," she said quietly. Maya clutched a folded document in one hand, her chin lifting just slightly, while Nia reached into the small purse she carried and pulled out a laminated photo. Together, they stepped forward and offered their proofs not as accusations, but as unshakable truth. The moment passed, and the ceremony shattered. Guests rose from their seats in startled bursts. Phones were raised, voices overlapping in confusion. Security, still stunned by the lack of protocol, exchanged anxious looks but received no orders. Louise Lawrence pushed up from her seat, her features contorted with outrage, and turned to her husband. Caroline was already leaving, veil torn from her hair by her own hand, trailing a fury that no headline would forgive. The senator followed, face pale, whispers spiraling in their wake, and Graham, caught in the middle of this unraveling fabric, stood motionless. For the first time in years, he had no script, no path to follow, only her and them. That evening, while the news began to spread like fire across the digital ether, Amara did not seek interviews. She gathered her daughters, took them to a quiet hotel, and ordered room service with chocolate milk and spaghetti and silence. Maya climbed onto her lap. Nia brushed Amara's hair with the quiet care of a child still processing an adult world. No one cried. There was no triumph, only the weight of truth laid bare. Graham didn't sleep. The estate emptied in record time. Louise made calls to lawyers and PR agents, issuing denials and containment strategies, but Graham listened to none of it. He spent the night in the library with a drink that stayed full and a mind that refused to quiet. He remembered her laugh, the way she corrected his grammar with mockery in the mornings, how she had told him she believed in justice more than love, because justice was love in action. He remembered the last time he had seen her face twisted in anguish, the night he threw her out based on papers that now, in retrospect, reeked of artifice. He remembered how quickly his mother had produced proof, how neatly the transition had been arranged. And he remembered the hollow ache that had followed her departure, an ache he had packed away in favor of curated dinners and polite, forgettable women. Now he knew why the ache had never healed. It wasn't loss, it was cowardice. 3 days passed, no word from her. The world buzzed and gossiped and speculated, but Amara remained silent. Graham's attempts to reach her were deflected. Her name, according to hospital records, no longer existed. Her address was unlisted. She was a ghost with a stethoscope. The girls were unnamed. There were no footprints to follow. So he searched the only way he knew how, not as a lover, but as a businessman. He poured resources into background checks, cross-referenced educational institutions, followed grant records. What he found stunned him. Dr. Amara Blake, her maiden name, not the one she had carried during their marriage, was a celebrated figure in the underfunded healthcare community. Her name appeared on research cited in congressional hearings about medical equity. She had founded a clinic that now operated across 3 boroughs and employed over 30 staff. Her face had been on billboards promoting community health in Harlem. There were articles in academic journals praising her cancer outreach programs and maternal health protocols. She had built an empire in the shadow of the system that had discarded her, and she had done it with 2 children. There were photos, few and far between, mostly blurred shots from public events, but one in particular stole the breath from Graham's lungs. Amara at a lectern, mid-speech, her daughters in the front row, drawing in notepads. They were older than he had imagined, tall, vibrant, alive in ways he had no right to claim. His children, they had his eyes. One of them tilted her head when she listened, his exact posture. He closed the file. Then he made the call. Amara, meanwhile, was not surprised when he reached out. She had known he would. She had not expected it to take 3 days, but she also understood the depth of the rot he had to claw through before he could surface. She refused the first meeting. She refused the second. She agreed to the third on one condition. It would take place at her clinic, not his office, not a hotel, not the family estate. If he wanted to face the future, he would have to confront the space where her past had been rebuilt. He arrived early in a suit that looked out of place among the worn chairs and crowded reception. The walls were covered with children's drawings, flyers about prenatal care, and posters advocating for free flu shots. A toddler screamed somewhere in the back. A nurse glared at him until she saw his name. Amara met him in the corridor. She wore a lab coat over jeans and sneakers, her hair pulled into a practical braid. There was no trace of the woman from the wedding, nor of the one he had married, and yet she was entirely herself. They sat in her office, a small room overflowing with files and photographs. On her desk were framed pictures of Maya and Nia. First steps, first drawings, birthdays without balloons. Graham began to speak, but she raised a hand. "No apologies," she said. "Not yet." He nodded, silent. "I want you to understand something," she continued. "I didn't come to your wedding for revenge. I came because my daughters deserve to know who they are, and because you deserve to know what your mother did in your name." His throat tightened. "Do I blame you?" she asked. "Yes. Not for being lied to, but for choosing comfort over truth. You never gave me the benefit of the doubt. You never asked questions. You believed what fit easiest into your world." "I was afraid," he said quietly. "Of me? Of losing everything." She met his gaze. "You lost it anyway." They sat in silence, the hum of the clinic a backdrop to the dissonance between them. Eventually, Graham spoke again. "I want to know them," he said, "not for my sake, for theirs, if they'll let me." Amara watched him. For the first time, his voice carried no entitlement, only need. "They are cautious," she said. "They are curious, but they are mine. I understand. You will meet them on my terms." "Thank you." She didn't nod, she didn't smile. She merely picked up a pen and began writing on a notepad. "Come back Friday, at 5. Bring no one." He rose. "I'll be here." He was. And so began the long, tentative path between estrangement and responsibility. Graham met his daughters not as a father, but as a stranger with history behind him and hope in his hands. Maya asked if he liked stars. Nia asked why he had left. He didn't lie, he didn't embellish, he simply said he had been wrong and that he wanted to be better. They listened. Children often do, more wisely than adults believe. In the months that followed, Graham volunteered at the clinic. He pushed papers, stocked shelves, drove patients to appointments. He never asked for praise. He never took credit. He worked beside Amara's staff with quiet humility, slowly earning their tolerance, then respect. Amara did not welcome him back. Not completely, but she watched. And one night, as the girls lay asleep on cots in the back office, and the clinic lights flickered in exhausted rhythm, she stepped onto the rooftop where he stood staring at the city skyline. "Why now?" she asked. He didn't turn around. "Because I saw the life you built without me, and I realized I could never deserve it, but I could at least honor it." She studied him, the man she had loved, the man who had failed her, the man who had perhaps changed. "Then don't come back for me," she said. "Come back for them." He nodded. "I already have." The morning of the meeting dawned clear and unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Graham stood before the mirror in his private study, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal gray jacket, his mind a hurricane of unspoken thoughts. He had barely slept. The events of the past weeks had upended every carefully structured belief he had built his life around, and now, as he stared into his own weary reflection, he felt less like the heir to a biopharmaceutical empire and more like a man unmade. The face that looked back at him was thinner, more drawn, a man no longer hidden behind his curated image. Behind him, the house stood still, emptied of guests, stripped of florals and music, a hollow echo of the grandeur it had flaunted. The ceremony had never resumed. Caroline had left the estate that day in a cloud of humiliation, her father following shortly behind, hurling thinly veiled threats of political reprisal. Louise, cornered by reporters and scandal, had taken refuge in their main property, leaving a trail of denials and furious voicemails. The family name had been splashed across the headlines, not for merger announcements or philanthropic milestones, but for betrayal, illegitimacy, and the return of the forgotten wife and her children. Graham did not run from it. Not this time. He walked into the clinic's waiting room shortly before 5, nodding to the receptionist who had come to tolerate his presence and then, slowly, trust it. He had come here almost daily since Amara had allowed him into her world, not to reclaim anything, but to witness it, to earn ground where once he had only conquered. The clinic hummed with end-of-day routine, nurses preparing charts, janitorial staff sweeping the corners, a few stragglers still waiting for prescriptions. The scent of antiseptic mixed with faint notes of lavender from the diffuser Amara insisted on keeping by the front desk. It was a place that smelled like work and care and dignity. She met him in the hallway, dressed in a soft green sweater and slacks, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked neither welcoming nor cold, her expression measured as always. Her eyes carried weight. It was no longer anger he saw in them. It was stewardship. "They're in my office," she said simply, and he followed her without question. The room was small, but lived in. The shelves overflowed with books and medical journals. On the walls hung drawings, rainbows, stick figures with stethoscopes, a painting of a woman in a cape labeled Mom. Maya and Nia sat side by side on the small couch near the window, a board game between them. They looked up when he entered, eyes wide with curiosity. Amara motioned to the chair across from them. He knelt instead. "Hi," he said. "I'm Graham." "We know," Maya replied. Nia simply nodded. "Thank you for letting me see you again." "You're our dad," Nia said, her voice soft as if still testing the word. "I am," he said, feeling it land in his chest like a prayer. If you want me to be." They didn't answer, but Maya leaned forward and offered him a game piece. "We're playing checkers. You can be red." In that moment, something shifted. It was not forgiveness nor reconciliation. It was the first seed of something harder to name, more valuable for its fragility. They played until the game ended, and then another. The girls talked about school, their favorite foods, the books they liked. They didn't ask where he had been. They didn't accuse. Children did not deal in timelines. They dealt in presence. Amara watched from her desk, quietly taking notes on patient charts, though she missed nothing. She didn't interrupt when Graham stayed later than planned, or when the girls asked if he could come back the next week. But when he rose to leave, she walked him to the door. "They'll ask questions," she said. "Eventually. I'll answer them. Honestly. Good, because I won't edit the truth for you. I wouldn't ask you to." She looked at him for a long time. "There's more you don't know." He blinked. "More? I have documents. Financial, legal, the messages, the forged ones, the surveillance, the call logs between your mother and my former supervisor. It was a coordinated removal, Graham. Not just of me, of my future, of the children. She planned every part of it. His jaw tensed. I believe you. Amara studied his face, gauging the sincerity, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim folder. You'll want to sit down when you read this, and you'll want a lawyer who doesn't answer to your family. The folder was thick with dates, invoices, internal memos, and a notarized statement from a former IT employee at Lawrence Biomedical, outlining directives from Louise to eliminate distractions that threatened company leadership optics. The IT specialist had been 19 at the time. He hadn't known what he was doing, but his conscience had caught up with him. Now, his confession, alongside timelines of asset freezes and manipulated emails, formed the beginning of what Amara called a reckoning. Why didn't you go to the press? Graham asked when he finally looked up. Because I'm not here to destroy the Lawrence name. I'm here to protect mine. The next week, Graham stood in front of the board of directors. He presented them with the folder and a plan, an internal audit, the immediate resignation of Louise from all governance roles, and a public acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. The board, shocked into silence, could barely speak. Louise was recalled from Maine under threat of criminal investigation. Her silence in the face of mounting evidence sealed her exit. The company wavered on the edge of collapse. But Amara was not finished. 2 days later, she arrived at Graham's office unannounced, dressed in navy slacks and a white blouse, carrying a proposal in her hand. It was not a lawsuit. It was a merger. Her clinic, now a network of 4 branches, had developed a new community health platform for scalable distribution of preventative care. Her research in early-stage cancer treatment had been gaining quiet acclaim. She had the data, the pilot results, and the human capital. What she lacked was infrastructure. Lawrence Biomedical had it in spades. The offer was clear, a partnership built on ethical standards, transparency, and community service. Equal ownership. No executive veto from either side. And every product born from the merger would include community trial assessments before FDA presentation. It would be a revolution in how pharmaceuticals engaged with the people they claimed to serve. Graham read the proposal twice. Then he said yes. The announcement hit the industry like a thunderclap. Journalists tried to spin it as a publicity repair, but those inside the medical community understood it as something more profound. A black woman from the margins had not only returned, she had rewritten the entire script. Months passed. The girls adapted to a shared life. They spent weekdays with Amara, weekends with Graham. Holidays alternated. They still called her Mom, and him Graham, though Maya had once slipped and said Dad before blushing and hiding behind a pillow. He never forced the word again. He only lived into it. Amara remained separate from him. She never reopened the door to intimacy, though their partnership in the company grew into something powerful. They argued, yes, often, but there was respect between them now. Not the fragile civility of old acquaintances, but the hard-won esteem of equals. On the anniversary of the interrupted wedding, Amara hosted a community gala at the Central Clinic. White roses adorned the courtyard, not as a mockery of what had been, but as a quiet reclaiming. Guests came from across the city, patients, nurses, donors, activists. Graham stood in the crowd, watching as Amara gave a speech not about the past, but the future. She never mentioned his name, but afterward she found him by the donation table, handed him a glass of lemonade, and said, "They're going to need you for pictures. You helped make this happen." "I just followed your lead," he said. She tilted her head. "For once, you did." Then, to his surprise, she smiled. And it was that smile, not the photos, not the accolades, not the applause, that told him he had finally begun to make things right. Later that night, after the guests had left and the girls were asleep in the car, Graham leaned against his car door and watched Amara lock up the building. The sign over the clinic's door read, Blake Lawrence Health Center. It had been her idea. "I still don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. She looked at him, her keys in hand, her eyes steady. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for. It's something you live." Then she nodded toward the girls. "They're watching. Always, so live it." And with that, she walked to her car, started the engine, and disappeared into the night. Graham remained standing, alone in the quiet street, surrounded by the scent of roses and the knowledge that the woman he had once discarded had not only risen, she had brought him with her. Not to reclaim the past, but to demand a better future. One built not on silence or legacy, but on truth, and the children who would carry it forward. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for stories that inspire and challenge. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.